views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hey there, it's time for the Bronx Buzz. As you probably know, this is the program where we get to talk to Bronx journalists and writers and talk show hosts and anybody really covering the issues that are important to us. And the whole idea is you get to find out what they're thinking about, what they're writing, get to meet them so that when you read them or see them or hear them, you get to know a lot more about where it's all coming from. Today we have a great show. We have Marlene Peralta from Progressive Cities with us. Nice to have you back on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We were just talking about all different kinds of issues, and the largest issue is the largest thing that happened in the United States, and that is the State of the Union. But before we even break that down, it occurs to me, because I had this dialogue with some other people who were like, well, that's not local, it's just the president. But I think we've got to understand that what comes out of Washington, especially in this day and age, is very local. So why don't we talk about the relevancy of what we heard in the State of the Union to the people of the Bronx? What do you think?
Well, there's many things he mentioned that has a lot to do with the Bronx, right? All the tax cuts that he was bragging about, right? How is that going to affect the pockets of Bronx families? It's one major thing, right? He said, oh, I doubled the child tax credit, right? A lot of families depend on that tax credit every year, right? What does that mean for Bronx family? And in my perspective, a lot of the low income and middle class families are not going to benefit from it, right? Because yes, you may see an increase on your child tax credit, but then all the deductibles that you used to get before are not going to happen. So that's going to bring down any sort of reimbursement that you get from your taxes.
There always seems to be something to say, oh, well, that would be good, but then it seems to mask some other aspect of it.
Yeah, the devil is in the details, like they say.
I was a little surprised that you didn't come right back at me, especially with the nature of the Bronx, and talk about immigration and talk about...
That was my second point.
I beat her to the punch.
Yes.
And talk about Dreamers. Everywhere you go, especially in the Bronx, you hear people talking about it. To me, the biggest issue, which is the overriding issue, is the partisanship, is that they just can't seem to sit around the same table and come to an agreement, a balance on what you want. Like you and I, if we had a disagreement, we would sit down and try and sort it out. They can't seem to do that. I mean, I don't know. I know I didn't ask you a question because I'm out of ideas on how to solve it.
Well, I mean, you have polar opposites in this administration, right? Because you have the most extreme conservatives taking over the White House, and then you have the Democrats. So I think, and coming back to immigration, for example, right? He wants to give a path to citizenship to young immigrants, to dreamers. But then on the other side, he wants to limit all kinds of immigrations, all kinds of visa lotteries. He wants to build the wall, everything that Democrats have been opposed to.
Well, this is, again, that same balance. So you say, okay, we'll make a deal with you on DACA. We'll work that out. But then you give us the wall. Well, then you're not really endorsing the concept of having people all share in the wealth and the productivity of our country, because then ultimately you're really saying this. What is incredible to me, at least to me, and if you and me were, if the two of us were sitting together, I believe we could nail it. We could knock it out. And the key is the path to citizenship. If there was a path to citizenship, then those people who we hear about all the time who are 30 years in this country, but never had a path to citizenship, they never had an option other than to be undocumented. That to me is, of course, the bottom line.
Yes, but again, the devil is in the details. If you get a path, the proposal that he's put forth right now is we give a path to citizenship to 1.8 million dreamers, but then that means the exchange to that is we're going to deport your parents because your parents are not going to get any relief or not going to get any benefit out of this. We're going to cut chain migration, what they said,
Well,
they referred to.
there's no question that he was inaccurate about what that anybody's relatives could come in. I mean, you and I are related somewhere. We could go through all those.
No, he made it
genealogies.
seem like it's so easy to bring your entire family from your country,
Which,
which
of
is
course, is
not.
not true.
That's false. It takes just to bring a relative. Sometimes takes even 10 years to get here. So it's not as easy as he says.
So here's another question, which to me is the core, because there is an immense amount of resentment for people who support much stronger rules against undocumenteds. There's an immense amount of resentment. You know what? You're illegal. You shouldn't be here, et cetera, et cetera. What is the real cost to America for having them? As I see it, there are many who are hardworking because they maybe appreciate the value more than those of us who might have been born here, the value of our free society. And number two, in many cases, they fill jobs and take jobs that, whether they're migrant workers working on farms or migrant workers working on the docks or wherever it is, they take jobs that are not being filled anyway. I think they said they went to 7-Eleven and rounded up whatever the number was, thousands of undocumenteds. Are those jobs now all of a sudden being filled by people who are traditional American citizens?
And
that would be my
that's the
question.
false impression that this administration is giving to the American public, that the immigrants are taking jobs away from Americans. And that's not true. I mean, if you live the farming industry is a big example. How these there's a few states that are very nervous because they have lost their workers and nobody is replacing those workers that they have lost due to deportations. So that's the greatest example of all.
Let's talk about the whole notion of jobs. The president talked about creating new jobs, and I think immediately as soon as the tax cuts happened, Walmart gave all their employees a $1,000 bonus. But that $1,000 goes pretty quick, especially when you have
There was a massive
healthcare
layoff after that.
And then there were massive layoffs out of that. The Wall Street is up, obviously, historically it's up. What is the state of the economy? And I hate to use the word, and what is the trickle down to people in the Bronx who, in many cases, have low incomes? Is there a trickle down?
Well, he's looking out for the rich, for the Wall Street. He's not looking down for the average family in the Bronx. And that's the bottom line here. And as I mentioned in my example of the tax breaks, right? The lowest income need those tax credits the most. But he's actually broadening the threshold of families who can qualify for tax credits, and there are people with better incomes. So they're not looking down. They're not looking out for the average Bronx family.
Which brings up the Democratic response. Joe Kennedy, and we were having a little dialogue about this before the show. For me, what was very interesting, it was the first time that I heard really any national moment for a Democrat who articulated in some form what a Democratic policy is, which I have editorialized here and to my friends, that I thought Chuck Schumer blew his opportunity after when the shutdown happened, because he should have said, this is what we believe in. Instead, he went and criticized the president, which he's not getting. I mean, people who agree with him don't like the president anyway. I thought Joe Kennedy did a good job at articulating a platform that the Democrats might use in the upcoming midterm elections. Your thoughts?
Well, to me is, there's a lot of talk and lack of actions, right? And the shutdown was a perfect example of how, we need to negotiate. And again, Democrats have not gotten anything.
Yeah, there was no. Well, but they did get 6 years of CHIP funding. I mean, that is significant, and that was something they wanted. But you see, part of the problem, You didn't acknowledge that because they didn't promote it. They didn't say,
yes.
look what we got as a result of that.
Yes,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
that's true.
I know I interrupted you, but I wanted to make that point.
That's true. And I think one of the critiques that I've heard around choosing Kennedy as the person to give the Democratic side of the speech the other night, it was more of, the Kennedy, again, Democrats have not learned their lessons. We having
Well,
the
at
same
least it wasn't
people
a
over
Clinton.
and over. Well, the same thing. It would have been the same thing. Like they didn't learn their lesson from last elections, that people need fresh
new
voices, new face.
I mean, who would be the stars? I mean, Cory Booker, Kristen Gillibrand, or is there somebody out there you think that is yet undefined? And I mean, many people thought Al Franken would have been, but of course he's not in a position to do that anymore.
You know, it's a hard question. I don't know. Cory Booker, I used to like him. He's done some things that, benefiting Wall Street again, and
so it makes you suspicious.
It makes me suspicious about what his platform is. So, I wouldn't know who
And
to put there.
so in that response, to me, we have the biggest problem the Democratic Party has. Here's somebody who follows politics, who writes about politics, who commentates on politics, and yet you couldn't come up with somebody who might embody, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. I don't think they embody that vision.
Well, Bernie Sanders is an independent.
I understand that. That's what I mean.
He was not going to be the
Well,
one to do it.
Boy, there's a lot of people, and maybe my friend Marlene is going to disagree with me. I think Joe Kennedy could be that. He may be a little young and young-looking.
His last name is going to hurt him at some point. Yes.
Well, maybe, you know what he ought to do? Let's change it to Axelbank, and nobody will know who the heck he is. To me, the dialogue that we just had is a very healthy dialogue, but that's not the dialogue that's happening in America. It's not happening on Twitter, it's not happening on Facebook, and it's not happening in community groups. I mean, people are just resenting and saying, you're that, and they can't get along. We can get along.
I know.
Marlene Peralta from Progressive Cities, thank you so much. There's always more to talk about, and we'll have you back, and we'll talk about it then.
Thank you for having me again.
We are going to take a short break, and then we're going to go to the Bronx Free Press. It's free. And we'll say hello to our good buddy, Debralee Santos. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Sure, I look cute now, but when my owner lost his job, it was rough. I was living on the street, and one night, me and this Cocker Spaniel got into it so bad, I wound up looking like an ice cream cone. I cried a little bit, but thankfully I got rescued, so I'm running, I'm jumping, all back to my old self. And I'm ready to give unconditional love, even if you put a lampshade on my head.
It's not always easy being a dad.
Do you have panda asthma too? Does that run in the family? This is the home of the most priceless kung fu artifacts.
But when you make an effort,
Dad, we're not supposed to touch anything. Oh, sorry. Go long, son!
it's always worth it.
Whoa! Master!
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
I am gonna get you. I'm gonna get you.
Call 877-4DAD-411 or visit fatherhood.gov to learn more.
Hamilton was adopted from a rescue in 2008. He really likes to be around people. And as soon as I start to make my breakfast, Hamilton is right there. I get out my mat and I'm doing a downward dog and he's underneath. He's quite the pug about town. He gets invited to a lot of parties. He knows he's a pretty big deal. I mean, look at this little face. How could you not love him?
Back with you on the Bronx Buzz, and we are in the midst of a stirring discussion about the state of our union and the President's State of the Union address. And so let's say hello to our good friend Debralee Santos, who is with us from the Bronx Free Press. She's the editor of that paper. Nice to have you again, Deborah. How are you?
Well, thank you, Gary. Good to talk to you.
Good, always good to talk to you. So the president opened, like every president does, he opened his State of the Union address and said, "The state of our union is strong." What is your impression of that bold statement to start? And then we'll break it down.
Of that wonderful chestnut? Fundamentally, the president did what every president does at the State of the Union, and that is to tout selectively that which he believes, and has always today been a he. Noted that he believes is the strongest case for his past year or years, the successes that have been lodged, and cast a glance forward at what he believes he can build on. And in this case, we had a president who, when he presented himself at his inauguration, spoke of the American carnage, and then moved us rhetorically from that in a year to now this a new American moment. And so I think that there's some truth to what he says about the union being strong if you look at that union from a very narrow lens. The tone overall was very striking, was very telling. The idea of a redefinition of what American is was also heavy in the room, insofar as not only in terms of the things that were said, but also the people that were present. If you look at the cabinet that the president has put together, and the cabinet matters quite a bit because these are his selected designates in terms of people he believes can most ably represent his vision and execute it. You're looking at the most white and most male cabinet since Ronald Reagan. So when you talk about a president who has very specific ideas about what America and this American moment looks like, you're also talking about those people that are joining him in that effort.
To me, among the most striking things as a TV program is that in the past, you would generally see both sides. So you'd see the people who were, on whether they be blue or red, clapping, and then you would see the people who were sitting with their arms folded. In this case, I really only saw the people clapping, and I began to wonder who was controlling. Well, who was controlling the pool cameras? Because in the past, it was kind of very neutral. This I thought was very partisan, and I thought that was very telling about the state of our union. I think, and I don't think it's a surprise to anybody, we are more split now between significant ideological borders, to use an ironic term, than we have ever been that I can remember in our lifetime. And I lived through, Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon and all the way up, and I don't think we've ever been as fragmented a society as we are. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that.
I had a conversation with a few folks about it, both before and after the address, and the conversation for me sort of teeters on a very specific question. Are we better off, are we sort of living in the best of times or the worst of times? And I think that if you're talking about a family that involves a dreamer, you've got to be on the edge of your seat every single time this man opens his mouth for a number of reasons. And so there is a lot of division there, and this speech was not, I think, meant to strike necessarily a tone of unity, but really meant to lay bare a vision that has been his base, his very central core, if you can ascribe that to a president who shifts position so readily. But this is really as close to a distillation of his very core policy position. And if you talk about what that means to Bronx residents specifically, we're talking about a county, a borough that has long harbored, happily, one of the largest concentrations of immigrant groups. And when you talk about, for example, even a group from Ghana, you've got about 20,000 residents in the Bronx that are from that country, a country that was described allegedly quite derisively in a meeting. And so when people tune in and see this, this seems to be a continuation of a sort of disdain for this America that can include them. And I'll also note that one of the things that was also glaring, as you mentioned, sort of this omission of dissent visually, that you didn't really see other people in the room who might have felt differently about some of his words and they weren't clapping so enthusiastically. There was also an omission, a number of omissions from the president in his discourse as to groups that really are fundamentally the core of the borough. You're talking about, for example, Puerto Rico. When you have one of the counties with the largest concentrations of Puerto Ricans to begin with and is now absorbing some of the climate refugees that are coming from the island, and there was so little said, ultimately very little said about the disaster relief except for that sort of tip of the hat at the very beginning. And you're talking about a country that is still facing remarkable, just basic infrastructural challenges. You've got to wonder again, what part of the American moment, what part of the American story am I in fact a part of?
Yeah, you know, I criticize other commentators who I see on TV and they suggest it, and so I'm not going to be one of those. I think it comes down to, frankly, a racist policy. If you drive through small towns in America right now, you will see that people who own stores, people who own bodegas, these are people from other places. They look different. And I don't want to start picking out whether they're from the Middle East, whether they're from the Far East, whether they're, from some of the Latin American countries. This, to me, is the nature of America. And when I hear people looking at those people and wondering if they belong here or they are somehow stealing from what we all have built in America, that makes me think that their agenda is not financial, is not political, but is racial. And I wish I didn't have to conclude that, because it's just horrible and evil. But every policy I see leads me in that direction. I don't know if you want to go there, but I would be dishonest to myself and the things that I see when I watch TV if I didn't say it myself. So there it is.
Well, let me underscore that by saying that while you may be able to parse through some of the rhetoric and some of the policy positions and claim that they're not necessarily driven by the ideology that you've described, it's just not good economic sense for somebody who's touting what was his one legislative achievement this past year, and that was a tax plan that was passed at the end of the year. Although it does remain to be seen that the companies that benefit will actually reinvest those gains in their workers. That's a sort of a side note there. When you talk about, let's just kind of narrowly focus on the Dreamers for a moment. You talk about the Dreamers. There are about 13,000 of them. It's been estimated in the Bronx alone. But nationwide, and they're represented at CUNY, they're represented in many of our workforce spaces. But more importantly, when you look at the sort of the nationwide trend, this is just in fact, 91% of the dreamers in this country, in fact, are currently employed, and about 70% of them, if not a slightly larger number by last count, are actually employed in the top 25 Fortune 500 companies. So when you talk about whether these policies are necessarily driven by casting a downward glance on people who come from another place and speak a different language, or at least originally, let's look at the dreamers who sort of fit that original or prototype and say, well, this doesn't make economic sense. They're obviously contributing to our tax bases. They're obviously contributing to our economic gains. And we're saying to them, essentially, after this demonstrable success on their part, that neither they nor their families ultimately are welcome. And that says a lot about, I think, where this administration has been focused. And the idea that we're, again, in a matter of days, because we're talking about a March deadline, and they are, again, sort of unwittingly these political pawns, says also a lot about our, as you mentioned earlier, our very divided political system, period.
Yeah. I saw this video, and we see them, goodness gracious, millions of them, whether it be, in social media or whatever. But I saw this video, and I forgot the name of the town in Washington State, and there was a police chief who was like, in the beginning, I was all for this idea of people who are not documented, that they shouldn't be here. He said, but then I realized it was like, Hector, who I sit next to in church, that's the guy you just sent to, back to El Salvador or some other country. I didn't mean him. And so to me, what has happened is an appeal to the basest instincts to say, well, of course, we're American, we're citizens, whatever. And yet then when it fleshes out, all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, I didn't mean my buddy Juan, who owns the deli, and now you've destroyed his family because the father is gone, or the kids, and then you think of again the word trickle down. You think of what the economy of that is. Well, then you don't have a breadwinner. Then them paying for their ability to go to college. You know what I mean? It just doesn't work, and to me, it all starts with how you view ethnicity. I wish I didn't have to say that.
How you view, I think, perhaps more than ethnicity. I think what your vision of America is.
Who's American, right?
Who's American and what America is. I mean, if in fact you can look at these families and say you don't belong here, then that's a very legitimate argument to make for many people, and they have very stratified points on this. They'll point to the fact that they don't believe in amnesty. They don't believe that people should be jumping in line, as it were, and that rhetoric, and that policy position is usually backed up by a host of facts and figures that they also use. I will say that, given what seems to be this large groundswell of support for Dreamers specifically, just sort of to focus on them again, not to the exclusion of anyone else, because let's not even get into the conversation about TPS having ended, its very protected status having ended for Haitians, right, and El Salvador and people from El Salvador. I mean, this administration really has taken wholesale on the very question of the American identity. This is not a one particular program that they're chipping away at. This is sort of a real a re-examination of the American psyche. And so when you say that, you really have to question, in fact, if this is perhaps an absolutely polemic response to the previous administration that, had the historic administration of the first African-American president in all of our history. And if that was perhaps, some people have to describe it as some sort of psychological response to this previous history-making moment. But ultimately, here is what we must ask ourselves when we listen to this. When we talk about what we're
Debralee,
doing,
we're almost out of time, so finish that thought, and then I'm going to wrap it up for you. Go ahead.
No, fundamentally, I think we have to ask ourselves what it is that our response is to the vision of American identity that's being put forth by the administration. If you either agree with it, then you've got to do something about that. And if you don't, I suggest that you start paying a little bit more attention and take some action.
Debralee Santos, always a pleasure. I guess I'm going to conclude it with 3 words. Who are we? That's really what we're talking about. And it's always wonderful to talk to you, Deborah. Take care, and thanks for putting out such a great piece with the Bronx Free Press every week.
A pleasure. Thank you, Gary. You take care.
Okay, you too. All right, that's it. We have now solved America's problems, or at least we've laid them out for you, and we'll keep the dialogue going. A wholly different tone on Bronx Talk this Monday night. We will offer a tribute to the late Father Richard Gorman, who passed away. And so, unfortunately, it's something we're going to have to do, but I think it'll be a labor of love because he's much deserving, many people feel. Anyway, we'll see you around town. Good night.